Hello, my fellow gun theorists. Welcome to Gun Theory. Today, we've got a bit of a special video for you. So this is the rifle that we picked up for the thank you to 250 subscriber mark. This is a Century Arms Visca, or as most people are going to think of it, an AK-47. Now there's a whole lot in the AK development. It's typically best to refer to it just as an AK rifle or AK platformer rifle. But today, we're going to show you how this rifle works. So we're going to start with just minor controls, how things work on the outside, and then we'll work our way into the meat of this rifle. So first things first, we want to get the magazine out. There's a lever here that we push forward towards the magazine, and then the magazine comes out at a bit of an angle. And as for other controls, we'll notice this weird lever looking thing here. This is the safety selector. So in the up position here, this is safe. You'll notice that the trigger is dead, and then the bolt can only come back just a little tiny bit because it's being blocked. Now on a real AK-47, about the middle here would be fully automatic. There's no switch here on this one. This is just a commercial civilian version in America. But then all the way down would be single fire. Now, the manual of arms is basically to never use an AK in semi-auto mode. Most soldiers who would be using this probably wouldn't be very good at shooting single shot. Most of them are supposed to use it sort of like a submachine gun, where they do little 3-4 round bursts. Next, we'll notice the sight leaf. So like on a lot of older guns, we actually can adjust the sight here. And we'll notice that it changes the height of the sight. So at the very rear position, this is the battle setting. So this should be good for anywhere between 0 and about 300 meters in 7.62x39. The idea is that you aim for your target's belt buckle and it'll hit him, depending on range, anywhere from the abdomen all the way up to the collarbone. And that's a pretty good general rule of thumb if you're a soldier that really needs to be using this in a real battlefield condition. But for most of our target shooting, we're going to put it up a notch to the 100 meter mark is what I usually do. But it goes all the way up in 100 meter increments to 800 meters. Now, most people would probably have a whole lot of trouble even up to 300 meters with iron sights actually scoring a hit. But you totally can, if you practice, even shoot all the way to 800 meters with iron sights. It would be an incredible challenge, however. So I would recommend if you want to shoot with an AK up to about that distance, you probably want some kind of an optic on it. As for other controls, this one is not quite as common. It's not something you're going to use a lot. You pull this lever upwards and that will release the handguard and the gas tube here. We'll notice on the other side of the rifle, there's actually no scope mount. This is a choice made by Century Arms for whatever reason, maybe to lower cost on these rifles. So it really should have a mount here, but this one doesn't. Now that is basically it for controls on the weapon. So let's get into taking it apart and showing you how it works. So one thing we'll notice, by the way, is that there's kind of a big gaping hole here going right into the action, and directly straight down is the fire control group. So if you're ever in any situation where there's going to be contaminants that could make it into your gun, you definitely want to put it on safe to help cover that hole a little better. It's still not perfect, and there's some gaps, but it's a whole lot better than the big gaping hole when it's on fire. So in disassembly, the first thing we'll notice is a little tab here. So we're going to push in on this and then up on the dust cover. And we'll notice that the top cover just comes right off. And one thing out the gate to notice is that this is stamped sheet metal. It's stamped steel. It's very thin, a little bit flimsy feeling, and cheap. That is the major design philosophy of the AK, to be cheap, fast to manufacture, but still combat effective. So we'll notice that there's kind of loose tolerances on these rifles, and most of the pieces that can be stamped are stamped. Next we'll see that tab is actually on the recoil spring and guide rod system. So what we do is we push forward here, and we have to depress the spring a bit so it's got some tension, and then we release it. and then it just pulls right out like that. One interesting thing to note about the guide rod of an AK is that it's actually sort of linked like a chain here. So it's essentially two double-sided rods that connect exactly like a chain. And this obviously is very important for pushing the action forward again after it recoils or after you charge the weapon. Next, we'll see that the hammer here is down, and to get the bolt out, we really want to cock that hammer back. So we'll have to cock that back, and then the bolt will just pull rearwards. And there we have the bolt carrier and the gas piston. One thing that I would like to note is that this is a piston-driven gun. So we'll notice that the tip of the piston where the gas actually impinges is blackened. And then as we look down on it, it actually starts at a darker color and slowly lightens up to the rest of the color of the operating rod. So what happens inside of the rifle when you fire is gas pushes here, and that forces the carrier back. And we'll look a little deeper at how exactly everything happens with that. So once we have our bolt and carrier out, the bolt will rotate rearwards, and if you rotate it a little more, it just pulls right out. So we'll notice here on the bolt, if we can get it to focus, we'll notice that we have a locking lug here, and then we have an even bigger looking lug here. Now this is important because also the pin that retains the firing pin goes in, and you can actually see it a little bit right here. That just holds the firing pin in place. And then we'll notice the rear of the firing pin right there. So if a hammer smacks that, we'll notice that the pin actually protrudes through the bolt face. And we can push that back kind of loosely. So we noticed that the locking lugs look different. And that is because on the bolt carrier itself, we'll see a cam track here. And that is precisely how the bolt rotates out of the locked position or rotates into locked position. We'll see as we slide the bolt in that that first locking lug just isn't long enough. It doesn't engage with that surface. We'll notice that that next lug fits right in, and then if we actually just push forward on the back of the bolt, it turns that one directional movement into rotational movement. So if you just pull back and then push forward, that's very important for the operation of the gun, and we'll look at that a little bit deeper as to where these lugs are actually locking into. One thing we'll notice on either side of the bolt carrier is these two little rail sort of systems, little tiny pieces. This is actually used for two things. The most important thing is that in the rifle itself, we will note that the receiver is actually bent inwards at the top. And so what happens when we put the carrier in is we'll notice that this actually lines up rather well with those little bent in pieces. So we'll want to line this up and then just push down to depress the hammer spring, and those little rail holes, well, it fits that crimp, that little bend in the top of the receiver, and that is what stops the carrier from moving anywhere but straight back and straight forwards. And we'll actually note that as we bring this to the rear here, that the spring tension from the hammer actually just pops that right out of the rails. So looking inside of the receiver itself, now that we've field stripped it, we can see the hammer, of course, back here. We can actually just go ahead and... It's actually a somewhat weird looking hammer if you're used to seeing something like an AR-15 hammer, where the actual hammer surface that smacks into things is quite curved. One thing we'll notice inside of the receiver is this little nodule here. This interfaces with the locking lug of the AK bolt. We will note that there are actually two holes. This is where the gas piston goes through, and then this down here is actually the chamber. This is the end of the barrel. All right, so let's look at actually how this rifle works rather than a few individual components. So we'll notice on the barrel here, we have a little piece that's pinned on. And then it comes up into this tube, which then travels rearwards. And you'll notice that it lines up with the hole back here for the piston and op rod. So what happens when you fire this weapon is that a bullet will be traveling down the barrel, of course, and after the bullet passes this point, there's actually a little hole leading up into the gas block. So all of those expanding gases that are causing high pressures behind the bullet, some of them will vent up this way. And of course, the rest of them will still be blowing behind the bullet as the bullet leaves the muzzle. But what's important here is that that piston goes all the way forward to about here-ish in this gas tube. And we'll also note that we've got several vent holes on the top diagonal area of the gas tube. So what happens is that the gas that blows into here and is redirected smacks into the front of that gas piston, which is why it's all black and burnt, because these gases are quite hot. And so then the gas piston is forced rearwards. And we'll also notice these vent holes. So just this little bit of movement is all it takes to impart all of the momentum you need on the gas piston of an AK rifle. So as soon as it passes this point, any other pressure is unnecessary, and so it vents out. So if you overgas a rifle, if you didn't have it venting out like this, you would be accelerating the bolt way too quickly, and it would possibly be dangerous, or it would just beat the rifle to death a lot faster. The regular wear and tear would be very severe. So as that happens, the bolt carrier, which is attached to that piston, is forced rearwards. And as we saw on that camming surface for the bolt itself, the bolt rotates into place and locks into the receiver. But then as the bolt moves rearwards, it forces the bolt to move along that camming surface and rotate, which rotates it out of the locking position in the receiver and allows the whole package now to move rearwards. And we'll also notice there's a little bit of resistance as we bring it back to here because the hammer spring has to be depressed just a little bit, which further helps to decelerate the bolt as it comes rearwards. And then of course at this point it is back far enough, so if we had an extra magazine in here with extra ammunition, it would then strip around out of the magazine and go back. And we'll note that the bolt is actually sticking out, and the back of the firing pin that we saw earlier is right there. So if we were to pull the trigger on this, smack, it hits the back of the firing pin, which then of course fires the weapon. So we'll note that the safety is connected to this piece in here. And currently it is on fire, but we're gonna slowly turn that on to safe so that you can see what happens in here. We'll notice that it rotates a little bit like this. And what that causes is a little part of the fire control group, the trigger, to not be able to move rearwards anymore, because now it's being blocked by a little piece sticking off of here. And so the trigger actually becomes locked. And then of course the bolt actually gets blocked by the safety as well from coming back too far. So one major question that you might have, and the question that I had when I was first learning about the AK, is, well, if it's made out of pretty cheap stamped thin metal, how is it strong enough to actually withstand firing? I mean, that's very high pressure. Well, a very clever system, something called a trunnion, is very, very strongly pinned into the receiver. There's several pins that actually keep the trunnion in, but this pin right here goes through the trunnion and it actually pins the barrel to the trunnion. So the trunnion is very strong. It's not stamped metal. It's milled out of a solid piece of stock. And so the trunnion and the barrel will then lock with the bolt face, and so the only piece that actually has to maintain the strength to be able to hold all of those pressures in is the trunnion, barrel, and then the bolt. And so as long as the bolt properly locks in and it can't go anywhere, the only piece under stress in this situation would be the trunnion, the barrel, and then the bolt. It's a very clever way of making weapons cheaper, because instead of having every metal part needing to be milled out of very solid, strong steel, you can stamp most of it, and then only those few pieces that actually come under stress need to be made out of a good, solid, strong metal. It's very clever. One thing that I would like to point out on the AK is that the magazines work very differently than we're probably used to if we're used to seeing AR-15s and M4s in our video games, movies, and possibly in our own personal collections. The first thing to note is that there's this big tab that comes off the back of the magazine. That'll be important here in a minute. Then we'll also notice a little piece here, kind of angles down and then becomes a sharp shelf. This is what we call a nose-in, rock-back sort of magazine. This creates sort of a hinge with a piece inside the magazine well of the rifle. And we'll see that it actually kind of is stamped inwards just a little bit here. So when you go to put the magazine in, it doesn't just go in straight like this. It won't go. What you want to do is nose in, so the front of the magazine at an angle, just kind of jam it up into the magazine well, and then rock the magazine rearwards. And we'll notice that that tab on the back actually interfaced with this spring-loaded magazine release. And then of course we just push forward on it, and the magazine comes out exactly the opposite as it went in. So on the way in, it's nose in, rock back, but on the way out, it's rock forward and then nose out. So if you were to hold this rifle and you wanted the magazine to drop free, like in an AR-15, for example, normally on the AR-15, you simply press the button and the magazine falls out. On the AK, it's not quite the case. If you wiggle it a bunch, you might be able to get it to go, but that doesn't quite work. And so when you take the magazine of an AK out, there's a couple of different methods. There's one where you use the next magazine to smack this forward and to blow the magazine out and knock it out, and then you load in your next one. But generally speaking, you're probably just going to grab the magazine like this and have your thumb back and reload like this. And then we grab our next magazine and we reload. The next thing about controlling an AK and operating with one, it's kind of weird, you'll probably notice, is that the charging handle is on the wrong side of the gun for right-handed people. So most guns are made for right-handed people. There are some left-handed guns that exist, and there's a big rush today, a big push in the marketing to make modern firearms completely ambidextrous. But we'll have to remember that this rifle is quite old. In fact, it had its roots a little bit before 1947. You never want to break your firing grip on any weapon when you go to reload. But with the charging handle being on this other side, what choice do you really have but to break your firing grip to charge the weapon? Well, you'll notice in the footage of me shooting this rifle that I reach under the rifle and charge it like this. And with regular magazines, that works fine. It's a little bit uncomfortable to do, but it feels really cool. You could also just turn the rifle over a little bit and grab it with your left hand and charge it that way. But again, that's a little bit out of the way, and since the bolt doesn't lock to the rear ever in an AK, you have to charge it every time you reload. And with drum magazines, they're too big, most people can't reach around on the underside of the rifle, so most people will either turn it over with the drum and do this, or they'll have to just break their firing grip and reach up with their right hand. So that is something, if you ever do happen to be able to shoot an AK rifle of any kind, and you're used to an AR-15 or other sorts of rifles, that's going to be a little bit weird for you. So a brief recap, since there's so much information being bombarded at you in this video, how the AK works. So let's say we've got a round in the chamber and we've got a magazine in and we fire. What happens is the bullet is fired from the chamber and it goes down the barrel, and right at this point here, as the bullet passes this point here, some of that gas that's propelling the bullet is tapped off, and it slams into the very front of the gas piston. And then the gas piston begins to move rearwards, and then the rest of the gas vents because it's unnecessary at this point. And as the bolt carrier moves rearwards, that forces the camming surface to unlock the bolt itself from the trunnion. And then that allows the whole thing to cycle rearwards. And in cycling rearwards, it ejects the spent casing, picks up a new round from the magazine, and goes home again. One last thing that I would like to note is the tab that retains the handguard in the gas tube. This thing is a royal pain to try and do. You really can't do this with your hand, and we'll notice here that it's caused quite the indentation in my finger there. Something that most people don't realize when they try to get the handguard off, perhaps they're wanting to clean their gas tube or replace the whole handguard altogether, is we'll look back to here. Remember that rail that fits into the receiver? It was not an accident that this tab was sized the way it was. This rail, or either or, will actually slide onto this tab just like this. And so now we can reach all the way back to the end of the op rod here. We can reach all the way back, and we've got a much longer lever now to open the handguard. And you'll notice it actually just moved a bit. I don't want to take it off right now, so we're going to bring it back. But it turns a very difficult, stiff piece into incredibly easy work because of all of this leverage. We can reach all the way back to the end of the gas piston to do. And it becomes a very easy job. Many people don't realize this, and they'll try to beat on it with like a mallet, and they'll scratch their gun up or break their hand guards or hurt themselves a little bit trying to get that off. But super simple and easy to just use these little rail systems here. I think that's very clever in the engineering of this rifle. It's one of those minor things, sort of like in the Galil when they actually made part of the bipod retaining piece also function as a bottle opener. Just little fun, interesting things. So I found the AK to be quite elegant, where it uses a bit loose tolerances, cheaper, faster manufacturing techniques and materials, but it works together in a very elegant manner. While it's definitely not an expensive rifle or a very high quality, fine marksmanship sort of rifle, it's still perfectly effective in the field. And I find that to be pretty elegant. But I hope you learned something. If you like this sort of content, make sure to hit that subscribe button and maybe even consider becoming a patron of this channel over on Patreon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.